Hello everyone, my name is Parnali Dharia. I'm a woman international master and today we are going to learn about isolated queen pawn. Am I audible, guys? Can someone reply in the chat? Hello Aman. So today we are going to learn about isolated queen pawn. The position that you can see on your screen is one of the examples. So this pawn is called the isolated queen pawn, and it is a pawn that cannot be supported with another pawn. So it is an important concept, and this pawn has different characteristics throughout the game. So in the middle game, white will try to attack because this pawn will keep black tied, and white will try to play something like d5 in the middle game. And in the end game, it is considered as a weak pawn because it cannot be supported, as I said, by any other pawn. It can be supported with pieces, but it is a weak pawn in general. So another concept that you should know about isolated pawn is that e5 square here and c5 square are the two squares that are very important for white, because in the whole game he will control those squares, and e5 is considered as an outpost square. I'll show you one position about outpost in the next example. And for black, d5 square is considered to be an important square because he will try to blockade this d4 pawn by putting a piece on the d5 square. Okay, let's move on to outpost. So this is an example of outpost. Is basically when a knight is on a square that is supported by a pawn and by a rook, and also there is a enemy pawn in front of it. So whenever black tries to move the knight like this, then he will move, and then e6 pawn is a weak pawn. Also, one thing you should remember here is that black cannot play e5 because this pawn is there. If this pawn wasn't here, if it hypothetically imagine if this pawn isn't here, then black can just play e5. So that is why this pawn is very important. So this is about outpost. Am I audible, guys? Okay, thanks Aman. Let's move on to isolated pawn pair. So after isolated queen pawn, or isolani as it said, and we reach something called isolated pawn pair. So here black has the option of playing something like knight into c3 and b into c3. So this is called as the isolated pawn pair, and I think black should only capture here if he can blockade on c4 and d5. Otherwise it's a bad decision, because later on if this pawn moves, we will reach something called as hanging pawns, and it is very scary to face because you can't blockade those pawns. Just a moment. So this is the position you will reach, and hanging pawns are very dual in nature because they can be weak but they can be very strong. So if you have the choice between isolated pawn pair and hanging pawns, I think you should go for hanging pawns, because like after this pawn has moved, you can play d5 and you have more chances for attack. Also, if you have a bishop on c1, it can later go to b2, and then there can be a lot of attacking prospects because of these two pawns. Also, they cannot be blockaded because they cover each other's squares. So if you have the choice, then you should go for this pawn structure rather than isolated pair structures. So, so this is the position which black will opt for. This is the preferred position from black side, where he will have queen and rook, a queen and rook against queen and rook, so that he can have e5 later on. So something like this, and this pawn is pinned, so he can't capture, and he'll probably lose the d4 pawn. Oh, the first one is still going on. Is the first stream still going on, guys? Okay. So here it's necessary to have this position with black if you have to win. Otherwise, it can be a draw. Just in case if there were no rooks here and it's just queen versus queen, chances are it will be a draw. So this is the preferred position with black, and you should remember this position. Okay, so let's begin with the games, because you will have a lot of fun watching them. Isolated queen pawn games can be very attacking and very amazing to watch, because you can see a lot of attack against this again as compensation against the pawn. So d4, nf6, c4, e6, nf3, d5, and c3, c5. So we are heading towards something similar to Tarash, c into d5, and now here instead of capturing e into d5, he captured with the knight. But in case if black captures with the e pawn, then white has the option of giving black the isolated pawn by playing something like this. So later on, d5 pawn will be the isolated pawn. Are you with me, guys, on this? Or am I too fast today? Guys? Okay. Okay. I'll slow down a bit. So dc5 gives black the isolated pawn, but he captured with the knight. And now e3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight into c3, b into c3, bishop e7, and with this pawn structure here, e3, d4, e3, we may lead later on to isolated pair of pawns if he captures something like this. I'm so sorry. And then if he captures, and if we capture with this, then we again have the isolated pair. So he plays castles, and now he plays e4, b6, bishop b2. So now you might be wondering that bishop b2 is a bad move, because this bishop is not doing much here right now. It's blocked by its own pawns and this diagonal is not yet open. But the point here is, soon white will play something like d5 and c4, and later on this bishop will be the strongest piece on the board. So black has to prevent it, or try to prevent it at least. So he plays bishop b7, queen e2. So queen e2 is basically to get the rook here in front of the queen and have some threats on the queen. Black plays knight a5 in order to exchange this piece, but white denies the exchange by playing bishop d3, rook c8, rook d1, So as I said, it's a typical move. Whenever you find the queen on this file or any file, you should try to get the rook on that file, because there can be threats to the queen, and black will always be panicky in that situation where he has to think about where he should put his queen, because queen right now can go here, but it will deprive its place in the king side, the protection of the king side. So he plays cd4, cd4, and now bishop b4. So he plays this in order to play something like queen e7. So there's a hiding space for the queen now, and also I think he wanted to prevent rook e1. So Geller played bishop b4, and now d5. So whenever you get a chance, you should always play d5. Whenever you think it's not too premature and you're not losing a pawn, so you should try to play something like d5 whenever you get the choice. And if black takes the pawn right now, he took the pawn, but if he doesn't take the pawn right now, then soon there will be something like d6 and e5, and lots of threats here with the knight and bishop and even the queen joining later on. So d5 is a very important move. And Geller captured, Keres also captured, queen e7. So queen e7 was again played to exchange the queens and reach the endgame as soon as possible. Here, one thing that black probably wants here is something like knight c4 and knight d6. So this square will be the blockading square, and if it's possible for black, he will try to play knight c4, knight d6 as soon as it's possible. So rook e1, maybe bishop d6, and the game will go on. It will be a different game. So white did not exchange, because as I said, it's necessary right now for white to maintain his pieces, because his main compensation for this isolated pawn is attack, and without the queens it is very difficult to attack. So he played knight e5 and f6. So black here tries to force matters, but white has some different plans, and he plays the move queen h5. So queen h5 is a strange move, right? Can you tell me what happens if I capture? There's a mate. Post mate. Yeah, Wise Khan, that's a mate. How? Okay, it's an easy one. Okay, so white just plays bishop into h7 and king h8, bishop g6, and this is a mate. So you should always remember this pattern. Queen h5 was played, and now black played g6 to prevent the mate. You can take around a minute and try to tell me what white must. Can someone reply a yes or no? Is there a lag? Yeah, matrix knight g6 is the move that was played. Is there still a lag? Okay. So knight into g6 was played. H into g6. And What do you think? How should I capture? Bishop into g6 or queen into g6? Okay. Queen into g6 is actually slightly bad because now queen g7 is possible, and then you'll probably have to exchange the queens. Also, if you play something like queen f5, black will get the time to play knight c4 and knight d6. So he'll get the knight back on d6 on time. That's why he should probably capture with the bishop, and that's what he did. Bishop into g6 was played. And black played queen g7 in order to have his queen near the king, in order to protect it. And now, can you think of what Keres must have played? It's a difficult move, but it's a nice concept. How can you bring another piece in the game? Rahul, you're right. Rook d4 is a move, but rook d3 was played. Rook d4 is also possible, but rook d3 was played in the game with the same idea of rook lift. I think for rook d4, rook c4 is possible. That's the reason rook d3 was played. Yeah, rook d3. So this is called as a rook lift, and rook lift is basically when you it's like a shortcut, you can say. So you can't go to the g file directly, so you can go by playing rook d3 and then rook g3. You don't have to move any of the pieces, and you can directly reach the g file. So you can quickly move your rook to other side of the board with a rook lift, and this is a concept you should remember. And now the threat is rook g3 and rook h3 as well. So to prevent rook g3, which is a major threat, black played bishop d6. And how do you how do you renew the threat of rook g3? Any idea? Atul, the players were Paul Keres and FM Geller. Geller was black, Paul Keres was white. Okay, so here Keres played f4, renewing the threat of rook g3. As you can see, again, this is a threat and a lot of problems for black here. So here he played queen h8, and white obviously didn't exchange the queen, so he played queen g4. And now the threat is to play rook h3, and even something like moving the bishop to here or here, and a lot of mating nets possible here. So black gave a check with bishop c5, king h1, and now black played rook c7. So you can take your time and try to find out the move. It is a very nice move by white. You can take your time, guys. This is a very nice move. Matrix queen e6 is possible, but there is something more forced and very interesting. I think I just play king g7 here, and maybe you want to play something like rook g3, is it? Yes, so the move here is bishop h7. Someone mentioned bishop h7. Yeah. So bishop h7, and now if he captures, there's this mate. And if he doesn't, and he plays something like king f7, then just queen e6 check, king g7, and now rook g3 check. So there's a forced mate, and this is a mate. Wasn't it interesting, guys? This move, bishop h7. Okay, so let's move on to another game, another attacking game. This game was played between Gata Kamsky and Nigel Short, and it was played in Candidates in 1994. So let's begin. d4, knight f6, d4, e6, and c3, bishop b4. So we are in the Nimzo. e3, d5, bishop d3, knight c6, knight ge2, a into d4, a into d4, and now d5. So cd5, and black captures with the knight. Again, the d4 pawn is an isolated pawn, so he castles. You can remember that if right now black captures here, you can capture with the pawn and you will have isolated pawn pair. And I think white will be better, because this is not a great move capturing here, especially when you can't blockade on c4 and d5. So black plays bishop d6. Now white plays knight e4, and now again he is attacking this bishop. This bishop is kind of important because this bishop is not active right now, and he has to play b6 and bishop b7, so there's still time. So till then this bishop is important. Also it protects this e5 square, so this is an important piece. So he plays bishop e7 in order to protect it and preserve it. And here a3 is played. So a3 is a very typical move in such pawn structure, because black tries to play something like knight b4 and then protect this knight, or take the c6 knight to d5 whenever possible, and also try to black also tries to eliminate this bishop, because it is a very strong bishop again, because it gives threats on this diagonal and this square towards the king side. So a3 is played in order to prevent it. Also it has a different function later on in the game. You will see the bishop can go something like bishop b1 and bishop a2, and then on this diagonal. So bishop has some flexibility after a3. It can either go on this diagonal or stay on the same diagonal. Castles was played, and now he plays bishop c2. So can you guess what the idea is of bishop c2? Yeah, you're right. It's probably not the best to castle on that on king side when there's so much of attack. But I don't think there's much he can do, because rook e1, and there will be threats on the king anyway, because even on the uncastled king there will be threats with rook e1 and something like rook, and the e file will be very strong. So yeah, Manan, you're right. Queen d3 is the threat. So white wants to play queen d3, and there'll be a battery here like this, and lots of threats here. So that's the reason why bishop c2 was played. Black played rook e8. So he has a different idea in mind. He is planning to play something like bishop f8 and g6, something like bishop g7, get the knight to e7 so that to have some strong hold on d5, b6, bishop b7. That's how black is planning his game ahead. And white just continues with queen d3, so the battery, as I mentioned. And black plays g6 with the same idea as I mentioned earlier, bishop f8 and bishop g7. Also g6 here is a nice move right now because it is preventing some threats. Like if I move the knight here later on or anywhere, then there's a threat of queen into h7. So he is protecting that, protecting against that threat by playing something like g6. Also he has this idea. And white plays bishop h6, taking control of this weakened squares and also preventing something bishop f8 or bishop g7, whatever black wanted to try with bishop g7. He's preventing it by playing bishop h6, because if he plays bishop f8, now it's okay to exchange, because this whole complex of squares is very weak and there can be a lot of problems on the dark squares here. Also the king is very unsafe, so b6 was played and not bishop f8. Now here he plays rook a d1. You might ask right now if rook c1 was possible. It is very much possible to play rook c1 here, possible, but his idea with rook a d1 is to play something like f4 later on and then have this rook lift again. So he is keeping this rook here, and that's why he wants a rook on d file, and that's the reason he's not getting this rook on the d file. So rook a d1 was played, bishop b7, and now he played rook f e1. So again this e5 square is important, even though f4 is still a plan, but e5 square is very important, and he will try to use this complex of squares for his knights. Soon you will see. Black played rook c8, taking control of the c file. And now can you guess what white played? Hello Rachit. Slightly better, yeah. Knights are slightly better than bishops in closed position, but it depends on the position. Can you tell me what white plans here, or what white must have played here? There's something that I earlier mentioned. There's something to do with the bishop. Manan, bishop a4 is possible, but why bishop a4? Because anyways you're not going to exchange, right? Something like bishop a4. Maybe he can play a6 and b5. He'll just drive you off. Atul, f4 is possible, but he played bishop b3. And again, this f7 e6 is very weak. So now the rook on e1 serves a purpose, because he can have some sacrifices on e6 and even f7 later on. Yeah, bishop b3, switching to a better diagonal. Yes, you're right. Bishop g5. Bishop g5 is not possible, Matrix. Bishop g5 you can just capture, right? Bishop g5 and you can just take this bishop. No, I'm not going to capture. I don't think he plans to capture on d5. He has some plans, something to do with f7 and e6. So he played a6. Black played a6. I'm not sure why he played the move. Maybe he wants to go something like, I don't know, to be honest. It looks to me as a bad move, this a6 move. It's wasting a move for no reason, I think. Okay, so what is the piece in white's position that needs to be improved? Uh, Normally we shouldn't capture, um, because we shouldn't exchange unless you have the choice when something like bishop into d5 and he has to capture with the pawn, then it's fine to capture, because even he is he also has a isolated pawn. So that's the reason you can capture only when he can't capture with any other piece. So I think you can only capture when he has to capture with the pawn. Otherwise, you shouldn't trade bishop and knight here. Okay, knight. Yeah, you're right, Manan. Knight is the most unemployed right now. So he plays knight to g3, and now the knight joins the attack. The knight wants to go to h5 and have some threats like this on the king. Also, this f6 square is weak. So soon there'll be a knight sacrifice if black doesn't do anything. So knight b8 was played. I think here black was completely confused because he didn't have a plan. He has already weakened his king side, and all white's pieces are marching towards black's king. So he was just confused, and he was trying to maneuver his pieces to something like knight d7 and protect this f6 square, or something like queen c7, and he was trying to maneuver his pieces. I think that's the reason he played knight b8, but I don't understand why he played a6 then, because if he had to play something like knight b8, he could have done it earlier, because he would have this bishop a6 move and some threats. Now white plays queen f3, and all of the white's pieces are now active, you can say, because even the queen has joined. And now you will see that the f7 square is the target. Not a direct target, but it will be soon. So rook c7 was played by black in order to protect this indirectly against any threats. So what do you think should white have played here? What should white play here, guys? Yeah, knight h5 was played. You're right. The right time to play knight h5, because he can't capture because of queen g3 and there's a forced mate. So knight h5 taking control of this weakened dark squares in the black's camp. Black played knight d7 because this square was very important right now and he wanted to defend it, overprotect it actually. And now h4 was played. So h4 is a very typical move. Yeah, today's games are all full of sacrifices. So h4 was played, and it's a very typical move whenever this structure is there, this pawn structure. h4 is a very common move. So this pawn structure is called a triangle, and you can break it by playing something like h4 h5 or f4 f5. And it is always a good idea to break this, because if you get something like h5 and he captures, then suddenly this one pawn island becomes three pawn islands. So that's the reason whenever you get the chance, you should break the triangles. And h4 was played. Now can you tell me what happens to something like bishop into h4? You can take your time, it's slightly deep. Thank you, Atul. There's a very deep combination right now. You can take your time. Bishop into d5, I'll just capture with the bishop, Manan. And now white will be in some trouble because of the pin. d6 doesn't win a rook. He can play rook e7. But okay, you're on the right track. And now? No, you're on the right track. What happens next after this? Okay, that's a long variation. Just a second. 7 to f4 and then knight d6, rook f8. Okay, knight b7, rook b7, then bishop d5. Rook e8 here. How is rook e8 winning here? Yeah, there's something. It's not that difficult, guys. It is something that you will miss during a game. It's very much possible that you miss this during a game. You're winning some material here. You can try again because it's really unexpected. Okay, rook e7 till here it's correct. Now some move. Can you suggest a move for white? Am I audible, guys? King d7. Do you mean knight into b7? Okay, knight into. Then what can we play? It's something that you will for sure miss during a game. Okay, so I'll tell you the move. It's rook e4 and this is trapped. Yes, the bishop here is trapped. Hard to believe. It's not that deep. Rook e6 is just too deep. Okay, so h4, that's the reason bishop into h4 was not possible. And now this was played. Yeah, it's true because for sure you'll miss something like this in the game. Sorry for the lag, guys. Is it still lagging? Okay. Sorry for the lag, guys. So can you find the move for white here? It. Uh, Sorry, Rahil, I missed your question. Yeah, Atul is right. After rook e8, you can play bishop d5, e d5, and then you can capture on b7. That is possible. What should you play here, guys? Is there still a lag? Yeah, it's possible to play h5, but right now this is under attack, if you can see. So h5 cannot be played. There's something else. Thanks, Rahil. It's a very typical move in this structure, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so d5 was played. Just try to think the shock here, because Nigel Short quickly played knight into e4 here, and now d into e6. So try to imagine what's happening here. What if I just move the queen? Can anyone suggest a forced mate? It's pretty much a mate. Okay, I'll just say queen g7, queen f7, queen g7. Yeah, correct. So d into e6, and white played f5. Black played f5, and now just queen into rook into d8 and rook into d8, and now rook d1, and white won very easily. The game went on, but white won very easily. Black captures on d5 here. Knight into f6, just, and then you can take, and queen into f6. Regardless of how he takes, you can play this, because even I think for this it is possible to play rook into d5, bishop into d5, takes, and then again you have this queen into d5 and knight f6 move. So was it too fast, guys? I think it was too fast for you guys. And this, and there's a mate. So regardless of how you capture, it's a forced win for white. It's too late for black to defend. Can you tell me what happens if I capture with the bishop here? It's very similar to what I just showed. Can someone write down the variation or just the first move? Yeah, okay. Knight f6, bishop into f6, and then you can choose here if you want to capture with the rook or the bishop, anything, whatever works for you. So this was the game, and this is what happened because he didn't want to get mated with queen g7. So did you like this game? Let's move on to the next game. Okay, so this is Mamedra versus Andre Carlo. and it was played in Russian club championship in 2006. So let's start with the game. d4, d5, knight f3, e6, c4, e3, sorry, dc4, e3, c5, bishop into c4, a6, knight f, a6 castles knight f6, bishop b3, e into d4, and now after e into d4 again we have the isolated pawn. This game is going to be a little different because in this game you will see what happens if the king doesn't castle. If like what can happen if the king doesn't castle. So knight c6, knight c3, bishop e7, bishop g5. Okay, I'm so sorry guys, that was another game where the king doesn't castle. It's the next game. Let's see if we can finish that game too. Here black castled and white played rook c1. So with the pawn on a7 and then b6, rook c1 is somehow more effective. And right now also it can be played because you have this c5 square, because b6 is no longer possible. So knight c5 can be a good square for the knight, as I mentioned earlier. Knight d5 was played, and black wants to exchange again, but white doesn't want to exchange right now, and he plays bishop e3. So if he captures here, you might be wondering, I just said that he shouldn't exchange, and he's placing his piece here where this is possible. But this is completely fine because you can later on play e4 and you will have hanging pawns, but they will be stronger because they are in the center, and you can always advance this pawn and have a lot of attack. Also, this rook is getting opened up, so f7 will be under fire from this bishop and this rook. Even the knight can join, and this will be under fire, this pawn. So he captured knight into c3, and I think this was a mistake because I think black must have thought that now this rook is here, so maybe it's okay to capture. And instead of capturing with b into c3, accepting these two pawns, black, white played rook into c3, which is better. Again, you can see an example of rook lift. It's not really a rook lift right now, but if you manage to move the pieces, you will understand why this rook here can be so important. And b4 was played. Earlier I mentioned in the earlier game a3 was played. So a3 was played to prevent something like knight b4 and knight d5. So right now black's idea is to play something like knight d5, while as white will try to play knight e5 and f4 and f5. So you should remember one thing here: when the bishop is on b3 like this, if it's on this diagonal a2 g8, then f4 and f5 is a good idea because you're softening the diagonal, because if he captures then f7 will be a huge weakness. So it's always a good idea to play f4 and f5 to eliminate this pawn and to make this pawn a passed pawn. And knight e5 was played, knight d5 in order to blockade the pawn. White could have played rook d3, but he went back rook c1. He probably has some different plans for this bishop here, something like this again. So bishop d7 and queen g4 was played. So you can see already black has some threats on his king side, something like bishop g6 right now, bishop h6 right now, this pawn. Bishop b5 was played, and now bishop h6, bishop f6. g6 is not possible because you're losing an exchange. Bishop f6, and now rook fe1 was played. So again, this whole e6 f7 pawn duo is weak, and you will get to know in the game. Bishop d2 was played. Sorry, knight e7, bishop d2 was played. Just getting back the bishop. And now the threat is to play something like bishop b4, and even this knight is under attack after f4, f5, something along those lines. Queen d6 was played to deny this bishop this diagonal. And now can you find a move? Rook lift is basically when you move the rook somewhere where it can move to the other side very quickly. Atul, you're absolutely right. Knight f7 was played. And what happens right now? Can you try to tell me? On an a3 was possible. You wanted to play bishop b4, I think. Your a3, right? It's possible. But he just probably saw this, and this is a better move because you're quickly winning the game after knight into f7. So bishop b4, a3 is a good move to play bishop b4, but knight into f7 is better. Okay, knight into f7 and rook into f7 was played. And now can you suggest the move? Yeah, Manan, bishop b4 was a good idea. Which is the correct way to capture? Rook into e6, bishop into e6, or queen into e6. Okay, queen into e6 is a bad move because you don't want to exchange the queens while you're attacking. Rook into e6 was played. Bishop into e6 is possible, but here you are just probably uh, getting two pieces versus the rook, and you're getting 1 point because you got one pawn. But after rook into e6 there is something better. Can you see the idea? Yeah, Atul, you're absolutely right. The idea here is to play rook f6. So if the queen moves, for instance queen d7, then you just play rook into f6. You might be wondering this queen is hanging, but you will see very soon what happens. Yeah, Atul, you're right. So queen into g4 and rook into f7, king h8, rook into e7 was played. So you can see that I have a bishop and a rook against the queen technically, but these two bishops are very strong. Also this rook will be joining in very soon, and there will be threats on the king. Maybe white can just play something like h3, safeguard his king so that there is no back rank mate, and then he can just move the rook to c7 and bishop c3, d5. This g7 pawn will be weak, so a lot of attacking prospects for white here. Rook c8 was played in order to exchange the pieces, the rooks, and to pacify a bit. Rook into c8, queen into c8, and now white played d5 and black here resigned. Can you tell me why he resigned? Can you guess the threat? Because the rook is pinned. Yeah, it is fine as long as you have a lot of attack, and because queen value is 9 points and a piece and a rook together value 8 points, so 5 plus 3. And if you have a pawn, then technically you're a pawn up right now, because you have 2 pawns and a bishop and rook against the queen. So 9 versus 10 technically. Yeah, bishop c3 is the idea. Yeah, you can promote the pawn to a queen, but here bishop c3 is the idea, and you cannot really prevent this from getting captured, and this will be a very strong pawn. Also here this h4 is a threat, h4 and h5, h6, and d6, d5 pawn will soon go to d6 and lots of threats. So that's the reason why he resigned. He could have played for some more time, maybe queen f8 and then d6, but soon he will lose this bishop for this pawn, because d7 is in d7 is the next move that is going to be played, and soon he'll have 2 bishops and rook versus the queen, which is clearly winning for white, and that's why he resigned after this. So did you like the game? Do you like today's games, guys? Do you have any questions about isolated queen pawn? What can be the move if king can't castle? Okay, then you have to defend your king in the center or move it to safety. You can castle artificially, like you can try to get the rook. It will take you more moves, but you can get your king to safety by moving it um, to f7 and then to g8. So artificially castling can be one option, and you can keep pieces in your king, and you can try to exchange, so that your king can be good. If you go to the end game, your king can be good in the center. That is possible. Okay, so let's move on to the homework puzzle that I gave in the previous lecture. You want to know the answer to this position? It's not bad to be to defend the isolated pawn with a piece, because you have to defend it with a piece, because it cannot be protected with a pawn. So eventually have to defend it. So it's not bad. My next session is on 7th, Aman. So here the answer to the homework. Did anyone try this? You can still try it. The funny position. Yeah, it's a funny position. It's a composition. So what should white play here? I'll just tell you here. You shouldn't promote to queen, because then it's a stalemate. The king cannot move, and even though you have so many bishops and a queen, it's still a draw. So you promote it to a knight. So you just, rook is also not possible. Yeah, it's a stalemate. So you just promote it to a knight, and then eventually you win the game with knight and so many bishops. So a8 knight is the answer. Just a funny position. So that was about today, guys. I hope you liked today's lecture and the games. Good luck, stay safe, and take care.